Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for that. I must have ticked somebody off. Apparently, my video got flagged as being um, a copyright violation. How a live stream of me talking violates anyone's copyright is completely beyond me, unless it's the shirt I'm wearing, but that'd be a first. Um, just give me a moment while I re-share links and whatnot, and we'll get going again. But again, just bear with me. We'll be starting again in a second. I'm going to step off camera for a second and turn my shirt inside out because that is the only remotely legitimate thing I can imagine this would have been because of. But I'll be right back. Meanwhile, laptop is brilliant. Lisa, that's an excellent. Okay, I'm back. And Lisa, that is an excellent question. Let me restart from the beginning just for people that only listen to this since the other one seems to have disappeared. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and paranormal investigator and the Paranormal Encyclopedia. So tonight we're talking about werewolves, and the origin of werewolf legends, and particularly how much of what everybody thinks is werewolf lore is actually based on movies instead of actual legitimate folklore, to the point that even books and other sources that claim to be talking about the folklore are actually talking about movies. Um, the big problem, as I was explaining, okay, for those who don't know, this is why the beginning of this probably sounds a little rushed. Is I actually started when about 5 minutes in to this video, only to have it copyright striked for reasons I can't even begin to guess at. So I'm a little flustered trying to get back on track, doing it again. But anyway, the first problem you run into in talking about werewolves is which werewolf do you mean? Because every culture that has had contact with wolves have some version of a werewolf story. Lisa asked an excellent question, which is coyote comparable to a wolf, or is it something different? That's a great question. I'm going to get into it in detail in a little bit, but the short version is coyote is more of a god figure than a werewolf, but there's definitely a great degree of overlap there. Particularly because there are Native American shapeshifters who can both take the form of coyotes and werewolves, which would be the Nagaloshi, aka Skinwalkers, who are really scary individuals. Assuming there's anyone who's practicing those magical traditions. And the thing with them is, even if you don't believe in magic, if there are people who believe they can do that, they're still pretty scary individuals, given what you have to do to become part of that secret group. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So you find legends of werewolves all over the world, because obviously places like Japan or Southeast Asia in general don't tell a lot of werewolf stories because, to the best of my knowledge, wolves aren't native to those areas, nor does Africa. On the other hand, you find similar similar stories about other animals. In India, for example, there are legends of were-tigers. In Africa, there are stories of were-lions or were-jaguars. In South America, there are foxes all over Asia. Foxes are interesting, goes because you can have a person who turns into a fox and a fox that turns into a person, depending on the culture and who you're talking to. So there's a lot of different options. For that matter, werewolf stories exist all over Europe, going back hundreds of years, probably thousands. And they vary dramatically depending on which country you're talking about and even what time period you're talking about in the specific country. Um, let's start with the basics. The one thing that pretty much every legend can agree on is that werewolves are people that turn into wolves. Um, the first big misconception people have is that it's involuntary. That you get bitten by a werewolf, and then on the night of the full moon, you will be turned into a wolf or into a wolf-human hybrid, and then you turn back at dawn. Um, the full moon aspect isn't part of any werewolf folklore. I'm not aware of any country on the planet that believes you only change into a wolf based on the cycle of the moon. That being said, there are countries that have legends about someone who is cursed to transform into a wolf. For example, in one of the oldest written, documented werewolf legends, I should say, because it's not really history. There are werewolf stories that are actually part of history, and we're going to get into Giles Garnier and a few of those later. But the oldest legend of a werewolf that's pretty well documented is probably the story of King Lycaon. King Lycaon was a Greek king who was very proud and who actually was having Zeus as a guest at his home for dinner, and in his pride he decided to cook his own son, partly because why he did this depends on the version of the story. In some versions of the story, it was a pride thing or sacrifice to Zeus. In other versions of the story, he did it just to see if his visitor really was Zeus and could tell that it was human flesh. Zeus was infuriated by this because in Greek mythology, human sacrifice is a giant no-no, and in many cultures, of course, cannibalism is a giant no-no. So Zeus cursed him to become a wolf. Another example that you find of this is Irish mythology, or Irish folklore, more properly, I suppose. Specifically, possibly the most fascinating Catholic saint I know of, which is, at least in terms of the legends that are told about him, which is St. Patrick. In several Irish legends about St. Patrick, he turned various people who ticked him off into wolves. There's a couple of Celtic kings that he supposedly changed into wolves to teach them humility. But a bigger and more common version of the story is about a group of druids. The druids would not convert to Christianity, so he cursed them to become wolves. So there's even a legend that some years later after this event, a wolf came up to a Catholic priest to ask that his wife be baptized. The priest was very confused, but the wolf explained to him that actually they were druids who had been cursed by St. Patrick to turn into wolves, and his wife had been injured and was dying, and he wanted his wife to go to heaven. And supposedly the priest was in fact taken to an injured wolf that also had this power of speech. The big thing you find here, though, is that a lot of the stories of cursed werewolves, it's not really so much. It's not like they change on the full moon. It's usually for a period of time. Sometimes it's for the rest of their lives. Sometimes it's for 7 years. There's stories of families that they have to go to this island. When they get to the island, they take their clothes off. They don a wolf skin. Wolf skins come up a lot in werewolf folklore, and I'll get into why very soon, actually. But they don this wolf skin, and that changes them into a wolf, and they spend 7 years on the island as a wolf, at the end of which they take the skin off, they turn back into a human, and they go on with their human lives. But when I say werewolf, I mostly mean someone who through an act of magic transforms themselves into a wolf or another animal, because again, there are lots of similar stories, and I don't necessarily want to restrict it just to people that turn into wolves. So again, broadly speaking, werewolves are people that transform themselves through magic into the shape of an animal, most classically a wolf. It's worth noting some role-playing games and novels will call all things that change into animals lycanthrope, which is not technically accurate. The term lycanthrope comes from King Lycon, again from Greek mythology, but specifically means someone who changes into a wolf. Um, I don't know the linguistic origins of it, but there's a broader term that's generally more accurate, I think, called therianthrope. That means anyone who changes into an animal. But it's okay. You have these people that have the ability to change themselves into wolves. The question is, where do they get it from? As I said, being bitten by a werewolf is mostly a creation of Hollywood. Uh, there are stories. There are some stories where becoming bitten by a regular wolf can turn you into a werewolf, or any one of a bunch of other weird superstitions and things like that. Like if you drink rainwater that's pooled in a paw print of a wolf, that might turn you into a werewolf. Um, Certain herbs can turn you into a werewolf, but usually the two most common ways that people turn into gain the ability to take the shape of a wolf are either that they're born with it. You find legends like this, particularly in Germany, Scandinavia. You're either born a werewolf or you're not. If you're not born one, you can't. You're SOL. The other version of it is usually that you make some sort of contract with a demon or a fairy or occasionally an angel. That's a whole other aspect of this that I know I keep saying we're gonna get to that, but there's a logical progression to what I'm talking about, and you'll understand why as we get there. But you make a deal with this being. The being usually gives you a ritual, or most often a wolfskin pelt. Traditionally a belt, sometimes a shirt. You put it on, and that makes you turn into a wolf. You take it off, you turn back into a person. But again, in most stories of werewolves and creatures like werewolves, it's an deliberate act of magic that turns you into a wolf. It's not an accident. It's something you've chosen to do. Where does the next obvious question, I suppose, is where does this come from? And actually, the ideas involved seem to be very, very old. If you go back, and look at very old tribal cultures and animistic religions, there's this tradition that before a hunt or before battle, warriors would put on animal skins and dance and try to draw the spirit of that animal into themselves to gain greater power. Now, if you're going to go on a hunt, if you're going to go to war, you're not going to pick a cow. Nobody really. I mean, bulls can be pretty mean when they're riled up, but generally speaking, you don't think, I want to be a cow. I want the strength and power of the cow. You think of a predator. You think of wolves. You think of bears. You think of lions. Strong creatures that hunt. Because the thing is, if you're going on a hunt, bulls may be pretty mean when they're pissed off, but they're not hunters. They wanted that power of the hunt. And here's where this gets interesting. This idea of putting on the skin of an animal to gain that animal's power isn't just something you find in primitive I hate calling them primitive, but primitive cultures a long time ago, or in the jungles of Africa, or things like that. It goes well into the Middle Ages. In fact, I think a large part of the origins of werewolf legends in Europe may very well be the Vikings. So, first of all, for those of you who may not know, because this is not a show about Vikings, I'm not going to go into long detail about it. But Viking isn't, if I say Viking, I don't mean a culture, I mean a job description. Vikings are essentially pirates. They are from Scandinavian cultures and the Norse, but they don't have a culture of their own. They're warriors from that culture. They're raiders from that culture. And within that warrior tradition, you have this idea of the berserker. Now, when people think of a Viking, when a lot of people think of a Viking, they think of a huge, unruly, guy dressed in animal skins with a big axe who runs around just killing and slaughtering everybody. That's not true of actual Viking warriors in general. They were actually some of the cleanest warriors you'd find in the time period. These are the people, as an aside, Viking mercenaries, when they hired on to work in the Byzantine Empire, which was famous for just how much detail and importance they put on cleanliness, the Viking mercenary contract actually specified They were to be allowed frequent baths as part of their pay. Um, on Viking longships, we found toothbrushes, we found hair combs, we found a lot of evidence of hygiene products. Now, the one group within the Viking warrior traditions that do fit the stereotype are the berserkers. These were guys that would wear bear skins. In fact, the name berserker means bear shirt. And they just go crazy in battle. They'd attack their friends, attack their enemies. They just keep killing until they fell over and died or passed out. They were unstoppable. This is, of course, where the English language gets the word berserk. Why does this apply to werewolves specifically? Obviously, you can see connections to werebears, which are also very common in Scandinavian folklore. But where it connects to werewolves is there's another closely related group of warriors known as ulfzerkers that don't get the press that berserkers get. Ulfzerkers are exactly like berserkers in every way, except instead of putting on bear skin, they put on wolf skin. And the connection goes a step further than that. As we read the prose and the Eddas, the Norse legends, there are stories of berserkers who would actually change into gigantic bears in battle. And this is where the idea that werewolves can't be killed or need something special to kill them comes from. Because once a berserker is in his full crazed battle rage, you can't kill him. No weapon will kill him. What you have to do is that when the battle ends, all that huge exertion forces the berserker to go to sleep. While he's asleep, if he shapeshifts in the stories where they do, he'll shapeshift back into a human, and now he's vulnerable. Now you can just go and stab him with a regular weapon, and that'll kill him. But that's as close as you get to needing silver to kill a werewolf in folklore. A lot of people are probably going to listen to what I just said and think of the story of the Beast of Gévaudan. The Beast of Gévaudan is an incident that happened in France in, I want to say, the 18th century. Let me take a look. Where there was a series of attacks by a huge creature that was described as looking quite a bit... 1764 to 1767 is when this took place. Series of brutal attacks. People are being killed by something that eyewitnesses described as a huge black wolf. Numerous attempts are made to hunt it. Assorted wolves are killed by these hunters. And then the attacks start up again. Finally, the story goes that a French member of the French military, I don't remember his name, and I'm not going to bother looking it up because I don't want to delay myself any further, kills it with a silver bullet that would have been blessed by a local bishop. Here's the thing, and this is really interesting, to me at least. The earlier reports of these events don't mention the silver bullet. What they do, but where the silver may very well have come from, we're not entirely certain, is a movie. Again, a movie. Remember what I said at the beginning. A lot of what people think they know about werewolf folklore was invented by Hollywood. Particularly, it was invented by the classic black and white movie Werewolf of London. Wolfman. Some of it was actually also influenced by an older movie called Werewolf of London that people don't know as well. But the movie Wolfman invented the idea that you need silver to kill a werewolf. They actually took that from vampire folklore. And we know that the writer, the director, and the producer, and the various people involved in making the movie Wolfman actually went and circulated new versions of classic werewolf legends that better fit their version of the werewolf they were using in the movie. They actually changed the script on these older myths as a form of publicity, and as strange as that sounds. As to the actual Beast of Gévaudan, certainly there was a series of attacks that happened in France in that time period that were done by a wolf-like creature. What it was is a very good question. I honestly don't really have an opinion about it. I've seen a lot of people say that we've decisively solved this. It was actually a hyena. It was a wolf. It was any one of a billion other theories. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not saying they're right. I'm not a cryptozoologist. I'm a demonologist. I honestly can't tell you what it was or was not. I will say this, though. France has a long history of reports of werewolves. And, in fact, the whole series, and we're getting there. There's something else I want to get into. Well, it's about time to get into this, actually. But one thing that a lot of people don't realize, I think, is that werewolves were actually seen as a type of witch in the Middle Ages. Um, in many countries, particularly, again, France, also some of the trials happen in Switzerland, Lithuania, and Estonia, though there's this trial that happened in Lithuania that is really interesting, we're going to get to in a minute. But where people were accused of lycanthropy, specifically through the use of witchcraft. And we have records of these things happening, of what the accusations were, what the activity the person was engaging in that led to the accusal. One of the more famous examples, which is known famously as Hans the Werewolf, happened in 1651, when a young man was brought before Cadaver, accused of being a werewolf at the age of 18. He confessed that he had hunted as a werewolf for 2 years. He claimed he had gotten the body of a wolf by a man in black. When asked by the judges if his body took part in the hunt or if it was only his soul transmuted, Hans confirmed that he had found a dog's teeth marks on his own leg, which he had received while a werewolf. Further, whether he felt himself a man or beast while transformed, he felt himself to be a beast. They considered this proof that he had not merely entered the body of a wolf, but really transformed into one, which meant that he underwent magical transformation. Furthermore, he had given his disguise by a man in black, which was thought to obviously be Satan. He was judged guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. Another very well-known story is the story of Giles Garnier, who is a French hermit and a cannibal and a serial killer. He's known as the Hermit of Saint Bernard or the Werewolf of Dole. So he was a recluse living in the town of Dole, which is in the French Comte province of France. He had been recently married. He moved with his wife to an isolated home. Not being used to having to feed more than himself, he had a hard time providing food for his wife, which caused marital issues, as you can expect. And a group of children in the area started going missing, or were found dead. The authorities issued an edict encouraging and allowing people to apprehend and kill the werewolf responsible. One night, a group of workers traveling from a neighboring town came upon what they thought in the dim light to be a wolf, but some recognized as the hermit with the body of a dead child, and shortly afterwards he was arrested. According to testimony, he was in the forest trying to find food for him and his wife, and a specter appeared performed, offering to ease his troubles. He was given an ointment that allowed him to take the shape of a wolf, making it easier to hunt. He confessed to stalking and murdering at least 4 children between the ages of 9 and 12. With October 1572, his first victim was a 10-year-old girl he dragged into a vineyard outside of Dole. Savagely attacked another girl some weeks later, clawing her, but was interrupted by passersby. The girl died from her injuries a few days later. In November, he would kill a 10-year-old boy, again eating his thighs and his belly, tearing off a leg to save for later. He strangled another boy, but was interrupted by a group of passersby. Eventually, he was found guilty of lycanthropy and witchcraft and burned at the stake on January 18th, 1574. What's interesting here is that the trial was actually carried out not by the Inquisition, but it was carried out by secular authorities. Which also leads to another theory about werewolf folklore, which is that actually it may, in fact, at least with the werewolf trials in particular, if you listen to the story I just told of Garnier, you can see elements of a serial killer there. It's been hypothesized that maybe werewolves, just the way that the medieval and even early modern and Renaissance people understood the very real phenomenon of serial killers. Because even remember, in Garnier's case, witnesses claimed they in the dim light, he looked like a wolf, but when people got a better look at him, they realized it was a person there. But he's still seen as a werewolf. The other thing I wanted to comment on here is that this notion that came up in the Hans's case of, was he, a person trained in a wolf or a spirit, something else. In some werewolf folklore and some theological texts on the matter, it was thought impossible for a person to transform into an animal, at least by witch hunters and by the Catholic Church. What was hypothesized and said is that one of a couple of things was taking place. Either one, that the person left their body and their spirit form took the shape of a wolf, or that they possessed, a demon helped them possess a wolf, or that possibly the whole thing was a delusion happening within the person's mind, where the demon was convincing them they had changed into a wolf without ever actually transforming them. All of this is discussed at some length in the Malleus Maleficarum, because again, witchcraft is seen as a type of, werewolves are seen as a type of witch. And then it gets weird. It gets really weird, my friends. So, generally speaking, you can tell from these stories werewolves are vicious, predatory, and generally not considered nice people. There's a big but there. There's a trial, and if you're interested, you can actually go way back to very near the beginning of this channel. And you're looking for a video called Werewolf Fighting Witch Trial. But in brief, there's a man in Livonia who was charged with being a werewolf. The Roman Inquisition had heard reports that he was openly going around and telling people he was a werewolf. Werewolves are in league with Satan or witches, so obviously something has to be done. They dispatch an inquisitor. The inquisitor finds the guy and asks, "Are you a werewolf?" "Well, yes, I am." Inquisitor is clearly thinking to himself, "My, that was easy. So you're in league with the devil." "What? No, he hates me." What follows one of the strangest witch trials on the record. Because the accused werewolf explains that he's a part of an order known as the God's Hounds or God's Wolves. Legend goes, and the story appears in a number of places, that he was given a wolfskin belt by another member of this group and taught how to become a wolf. Then, 3 nights a year, each tied to the harvest, he would don the belt and transform into a wolf. See, what was believed to happen on these nights of the harvest is that demons and witches would come up out of hell and steal cattle and steal grain and drag it back to hell with them. These werewolves would shift into wolves, go down to hell, fight the demons and the witches, steal the grain and the cattle back, and come back. So the Inquisitor's left with a really weird situation. This man is, as far as I can tell, a very devout Christian. He believes he's serving God. And he's clearly not claiming to be in league with Satan. And a decision is reached. Several requirements are now placed on the man. First, stop telling people you're a werewolf. The man goes, "But I have to eventually train my replacement." The Inquisitor gives him a facepalm and says, "Yeah, you don't do that either. Keep doing your thing. We don't, just shut up about it." The man is then released. He is not tortured. He is not burnt at the stake. He is not executed. He is basically given us the Inquisition's equivalent of a slap on the wrist and then "don't do that again" speech. While the Inquisitor then turns around, walks away, goes, "La la 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 la, I'm not listening." because they don't want to hear about the fact the guy is, in fact, going to do it again. And that's not the only trial where this happened. It's not the only version of this legend. You find it all over Europe. Another, one of the most common places, and this is interesting. So I've got 3 people listening to me, and I know at least 2 of you, Lisa for Truth and Teresa Hall, Gulf City Pagan. Has anyone listening, and tell me in the chat, ever heard of being born with a call? Don't be shy. If you've heard of it, let me know. If you haven't, don't worry. I'll tell you in a minute. Oh, we're up to 4 people now. Has anyone heard of the whole thing about being born with a call and how it gives you psychic powers? Anyone who can answer this correctly can answer this and can tell me what a call is gets 10,000 brownie points. Brownie points have no actual value, but you'll get them anyway. And don't you want to have 10,000? Doesn't everybody want 10,000 brownie points? Is anyone still... Okay, it shows that people are still listening, but the chat hasn't done anything in a while. Is there anyone still alive out there? Did you all accidentally get eaten by werewolves? Okay, fair enough. So you haven't heard of being born with a call. So sometimes when a baby is born, they're born with a bit of flesh wrapped around their head, a bit of something from the mother's womb. I am not a doctor. I don't know all the details. Yes, Teresa, it's also being called born with a veil. Called C-A-U-L or veil, there's a couple of names for it. But you're born with this bit of skin wrapped around your face. Supposedly, it gives you the power to see spirits. That is part of the legend. But in Italian folklore, there are 2 types of people that use magic. Broadly, there are 2 categories of people that use magic in the legends of Italy. One are called Benendanti, the other are called Malendanti. Benendanti means good walker, Malendanti means evil walker. If you are born with a call, if you're born with this bit of flesh wrapped around your head, it has to be removed by the doctors. And if you keep that flesh, like that part's important. Oh, really, Teresa? So Teresa Hall, Gulf City Pagan, in the chat, has commented that she was born with a veil. Congratulations, Teresa. According to Italian folklore, I hereby dub you a werewolf. Because the Benendanti, this group of good walkers, people who use magic for positive reasons, and this was even recognized by Italian Christians. They're not evil. They fight witches. They fight the Melandanti, the evil ones who do evil magic. But they're also this type of werewolf. These werewolves that turned into the shape of a wolf to protect the harvest from demons and witches. So if you were born with a call, according to Italian folklore, you're a werewolf. You're actually the second person I've met in my life who falls into that category. And the first time I met somebody that way, it was long before I heard about the Benendanti. Yeah, I thought you'd find that cool. I think it's awesome. It's like, I sort of wish I was born with that. But no, I was born quite ordinary. Feet for, I would think I was born cesarean, but that doesn't have magic powers associated with it for the most part. So, I've talked a lot about European folklore, and I've talked about the witch trials, but Lisa for Truth asked me an excellent question about coyote, and I think it's a good point to start talking a little about Native American folklore. And then I'll swing back across the ocean and talk about some Asian stuff as well, because that's also really cool. And yes, your granny's answered that it's why you can see fairies and ghosts is 100% in keeping with general folklore about calls. The werewolf thing, as far as I know, is specific to Italy, and I'm not even sure all Italian folklore agrees with it. But yes, and from what I've heard, both from reading folklore and from people, the one other person I've known with call, it does seem to be true that it does give you some kind of second sight. I can't personally attest to it because, again, I wasn't born this way. But then again, I'm about as psychic as the average rock, so maybe that's why. But, so in native tribes, there are also traditions of shapeshifters. There are various traditions in various cultures, some of which are actually benevolent, some of which are extremely malevolent. By far the most infamous of the shapeshifters in native folklore is known as a Yi Nagaloshi, or a skinwalker. Yep, it's got like I said, it's folklore all over Europe. And probably, I wouldn't be surprised if you find it similar folklore in other places as well. Because Teresa mentioned that she was Scottish. So I don't think Scottish do have shapeshifters that aren't malevolent, but I don't think they have quite the gods werewolves idea. That's more like I say, Italy and in the Balkans, parts of Eastern Europe, some Germans and Scandinavians as well, I think. But so this group, the Inagaloshi, like I said, these guys are pretty disturbing, even if you don't think they can do magic. So the legend is that to be a skinwalker, you can take the form of just about anything. You can become an animal, you can become a person, you can even become a specific other person. You need the skin of whatever you're trying to transform into, usually, which is why they're called skinwalkers. But how do you become a skinwalker? Do you have to do you just stick on animal skin? No, that won't do it. Traditionally, you have to commit a crime. One of the most horrible crimes in Navajo culture, which is where the skinwalker legend particularly comes from, which is you have to deliberately murder a member of your immediate family. That act of murder is what gives you the power to become a skinwalker. Now, for skeptical people out there who don't believe in shapeshifting, I have to admit I'm a little skeptical about the idea that people can transform into animals. Myself, that said, I've actually seen a smattering of accounts from people I consider credible of it happening under extremely unusual circumstances. Usually some types of very powerful demonic possession, people will take animalistic features. But it's very rare for it to go so far as they actually transform into animals. But they'll look very much like a pig, a lizard, a wolf, primates, gorillas even. But think about it. If somebody in the Navajo culture heard these legends like this usually have some basis in reality. Case in point, the whole idea you can become a wolf by putting on the skin of a wolf, from a purely anthropological standpoint, without invoking magic at all, may very well originate from the Vikings and this very real tradition of warriors we know as a matter of history put on wolf skin during battle to gain the power of a wolf and became incredibly ferocious and insane and acted very wolf-like. So there's probably some basis to the skinwalker legend as well, which may not, because there are plenty of people in the world who think they can practice magic, whether or not you believe that they can. So think about this idea for a moment, that you have someone who has deliberately committed an act of murder just to gain supernatural power. Well, preternatural power. That's a pretty disturbing thought. It's not irrational that when you talk to a Navajo in particular, they don't like to talk about skinwalkers. And especially they don't like to talk about skinwalkers to outsiders, to non-Navajo. Particularly because you don't know who is a skinwalker. You don't know when one's listening in. I'll actually tell you a story about somebody encountering what he would call the skinwalker. My mentor, as I've said many times, I've had two. Father Joseph Brose told me this story once upon a time. When he was young, he got very sick. And from what he told me, at night, an owl would fly into his room. His grandmother, at one point, performs a Native American ritual because the grandmother in question was a herbalist and shaman from the Blackfoot Indian tribe. The owl stops entering his room. He gets better. Grandma tells him that the owl was a skinwalker. If Father was still alive, I would dearly love to have him as a guest. Sadly enough, pretty much About a month before he died, I had just broached the subject with him, and he was delighted at the idea of coming on the show. And then, just as we were ready to set things up, is when he became very ill with pneumonia and eventually passed away. He had some amazing stories and was one of the finest Christians I've ever had the privilege to know. Particularly because he wasn't a judgmental jerk of a Christian. But there are not, again, in Native American culture, not every shapeshifter is inherently evil. In fact, one particular famous shapeshifter that Lisa brought up right at the beginning of the stream was a god, among other things, which is the figure of Coyote. In all the folklore I've studied in my life, Coyote is by far one of my favorite figures. You find him all over the Americas. Navajo have pretty much every tribe in areas that have coyotes has a legend about this figure they call Coyote. So what is Coyote? It depends on which, aside from obviously being a coyote, or actually more accurately, he is the coyote. He's the original. He is the embodiment of everything that is a coyote in terms of symbolism and all the things we associate with him. He is, he isn't short, wily Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoons. Where do you think they got the idea? But what's interesting about him is, while you find legends of him all throughout the Americas, what he is and what he does depends on who you ask. In some versions of the story, he created the entire everything. In other versions of the story, he's a prankster, a trickster. In other versions of the story, he's the devil himself. The one thing that holds true across most of the folklore about him, and is why I love him so, is that he fits the classical folkloric image of a trickster. Tricksters are, like, remember, as you may be remembering from what I said next week, there are certain ideas that get stuck in the human mind. You find all over the world by different names, but with very similar attributes. Walking Dead is an example. The idea that the dead rise up and feast on the living. The idea that humans can become animals or animals can become humans. We're getting there, I promise. Is another example. Tricksters is one of the uber examples of an archetype in folklore you can find all over the world. Other examples from, Raven from Native American folklore is another example of a trickster. Loki is a quintessential example of a trickster. Hermes, the Greek god of travelers, messengers, and thieves, is a trickster. Kitsune, which is the fox shapeshifters of Japan, are tricksters. Tricksters usually have a couple of elements in common. All have a couple of elements common. They're almost always shapeshifters. All of the, less prominent in legends about Hermes, though it does come up, but you find in every other example I just gave, they're famous for changing their form. They all have a wicked sense of humor, obviously, hence we call them tricksters. But there's also this idea that they use pranks, they use trickery to teach people a lesson, and usually to bring down the proud and the haughty. Tricksters are often, while a trickster is usually not what you might call a traditional hero, they're usually not evil. Even Loki, as much trouble as he gets up to, and as much as he's fated to one day take part in destroying the world with Ragnarok, he also saves, Valhalla, Asgard many times, and helps defeat various foes. Granted, he often saves them from trouble he got them into in the first place, but he does beneficially help them out. He's a three-dimensional figure, not just a cackling villain. The one trick figure that frequently takes the shape of a trickster in folklore, who is very much a negative figure, is Satan. There's a lot of legend. Pick up Brothers Grimm. There's lots of stories in there of Satan filling a trickster role. What's interesting is most of the stories of Satan as trickster aren't really of Satan. Um, if you read between the lines, what you realize is it's a fairy or a pagan god or some other figure from folklore that has been Christianized into the devil. Particularly because they really don't act like the devil's supposed to act. They make deals, they try to fool people, but they honor their deals and they keep their word, and they're not generally actually malevolent. There's a story in Brothers Grimm about a man who is asked to go to hell and serve the devil for so many years, and afterwards the devil, he gets great rewards. And at no point in the story is he punished. He doesn't go to hell at the end. He's not an evil man. He made a deal with the devil. He honored his side of the bargain. The devil honored his side of the bargain without trying to screw him over, without trying to trick him. But back on point. Particularly tricksters do have this heroic role. There's an example in Native American folklore about Coyote that a group of frog people had dammed up the river and were denying everyone else water. If you want to have water, you had to go deal with them. You had to offer them something in exchange. Basically, you had to buy the water. Coyote saunters up. It's like, I would like a drink. I will pay your price. Okay. He dunks his head in the water and starts laughing. And while he's drinking, he starts digging. I'm like, are you done yet? It's been kind of a while. No, still going. Drink, dig, dig. And while they're all thinking he's just really he's got a thirst that camels are envious of, he eventually digs out the dam, and now everyone gets to have water again. There's also a story that you can hear on the channel way back when I used to do a segment called Forgotten Fairy Tales. I should probably go back to doing that. I like doing that. But where basically all the great leaders and gods got together to discuss what to do about people, because at the time death wasn't a thing. People just kept living. Most of them just thought we should just have them go away for a while and then come back. Coyote disagreed. He thought death should be the end, that there'd be population problems and things like that. So he, through trickery and deception, he actually brought death into the world. But again, it wasn't entirely an evil act. It served the purpose. It just wasn't a very popular decision. What separates Coyote from... There's two things particularly that distinguish Coyote from a classical werewolf. One is that he's a god. In pretty much every version of the story, he is someone to be worshipped. Also, another feature that you find in many Coyote stories, which is true of tricksters in general, is he tends to be a bit of an idiot. I mean, I love Coyote, but he isn't always the sharpest tack. But he is a god. He is somebody who's worshipped. He is someone who's prayed to. He's someone rituals are conducted in honor of. The other is that he isn't... His particular trait isn't so much that he's a person that becomes a coyote, or even a coyote that becomes a person. He's a coyote. He is a totemic figure. There's this notion, and I am probably going to butcher it. I know very little about Native American culture and religion, but I'm going to try to describe. And in fairness, totems are not the idea of a totem is not unique to the Native Americans, but the word totem itself specifically comes from Native American tradition. But a totem is a spirit guide figure in the shape of an animal. People will talk about, shamans particularly will talk about having a bear totem, eagle totem, things like that. And coyote is one of these examples. One of the things that people frequently misunderstand about the totems, if your totem is bear, you don't have a specific bear spirit animal who follows you around and helps you out. Your totem is bear, capital B. It is the spiritual embodiment of the concept of bear. Coyote is the spiritual embodiment of the concept of a coyote. He is not a coyote, he is the coyote. And it can seem like a fine distinction, but it is an important one, because, again, these spirits are essentially God. They're not, depending on the tribe, they may be seen as more as something lesser than a god. I don't want to. I can't think of a better term for it, but I'm going to say they're almost like angels, which is a very European way of looking at it. And anyone out there who listens to this, who is more, even just more educated on Native American beliefs than I am, I apologize. I know I'm doing a disservice to the concept, but they're this intermediary between the divine and man, more than, and they have a very guardian-esque role, more than being necessarily being a god in their own right. In other cases, they are god, seen as gods, or at least worshipped enough to be seen as gods. Looking at it from a different point, from a more west, depending on the point of view you want to look at it from. And again, I formally apologize to anyone of Native American ancestry or belief structures for the fact I am certain I just butchered the concepts I tried to overview. It wasn't intentional. So we're coming up near the end of the hour, and I do have something else I need to do this. Actually, I've got another stream to do this evening because we're doing the second episode of Night's Black Agents tonight. Finally tonight. Although again, we desperately need another player. Lisa, you want to do an interview with a gamer? You want to try playing one? I'm mostly joking, but if there's anybody listening who's interested, we do need another player. But that said, one last thing I wanted to hit upon before I sign out is the Asian idea of a shapeshifter, particularly because this intersects with the idea of tricksters with the fox spirit, or fox women, or kitsune, or the other names that are known by. Because the thing is, fox spirits, when people think of fox spirits, they tend to think of Japan because of anime. You think of the kitsune, you think of the fox that can take the shape, that can change shape, and as it gets older, it gains more power, and as it gains more power, it gains more tails up until it becomes a 9-tailed fox. I'll answer you that. But you don't just find the idea in Japanese culture. You find it in Korea, you find it in Vietnam, you find it in China. All similar ideas with some differences. Again, usually they're tricksters. Often they're associated with the divine. Sometimes they're seen as evil. Sometimes they're often enough they're not seen as good or evil. They're just seen as a thing that acts however it wants. What's interesting about fox kitsune, particularly, and a lot of the other legends of fox spirits, is when I say werewolf, I usually mean a person who becomes a wolf. In a lot of Asian folklore about fox spirits, a fox spirit is a fox that becomes a woman. And usually it's specifically a woman. Particularly the version of the story that I originally read, there are variations on this, is that after being alive for 1,000 years, foxes learned how to do magic. And foxes gained the ability to take a human form. Again, invariably the form of a woman. The way that you can always tell you're dealing with a fox spirit, though, is that two things. One, no matter what form they took, they couldn't hide their tails. And two, when they if you looked at them in a reflective surface, you didn't see a person, you saw a fox. This idea, like I said, it's very common in Asian culture, but it's not unique to Asian cultures. Africa has this, not the idea of foxes so much, but this idea of animals that take the shape of men as well. It's an interesting spin on the werewolf legend, I think, of what if it was the other way around? Which I suppose is a good time to do a shameless plug for two of my favorite series of fiction. One is the Dresden Files, which contains pretty much every type of werewolf I've talked about, and then some, including as a wolf that turns into a woman. And another is my friend and frequent guest on the show, Patrick Thomas' series Murphy's Law, which also has multiple types of werewolves and this idea of a wolf becoming a person. Both include both are very good stories. I definitely recommend it. And I think at this point, I'm going to probably wrap things up. As much as I'd like to keep going, I do have the game to get ready for. But that's going to do it for this week. We will be back next week. Next week, I don't know what I'm going to talk about yet. I'll figure something out. I always do. But it'll be 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, once again, for about an hour. I want to thank all of you for listening in. I love you all. You're wonderful people. I hope everybody is doing okay during the coronavirus apocalypse that it continues to go on. I keep making jokes about that, but I have to admit it's getting more and more serious. I just found out somebody I've met, I wouldn't say know them particularly, but they seem like a very good person, passed away because of it. And yes, I am also waiting for the next book, July 14th, Peace Talks. Hyper excited. Basically, it's a belated birthday present to me, in my opinion, because my birthday is the 11th. And then keep in mind, not only are we getting Peace Talks this year, but later in the year we're getting another Battlegrounds. We're getting 2 books this year to make up for how long it's been. But that's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank you all for listening. This is Kevin Mears. Remember, if you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to leave a comment. If you need to talk to me about something privately, you are welcome to email me. Email is in the description, and this time I actually put it there now instead of doing it afterwards. If you want to support the show, remember, like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you have a little bit of money to throw our way, patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology, link in the description below. But that's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank you all and say God bless. Good night, everybody.